What the guardians did to young enslaved women at night was unthinkable, and the ledger turned that unthinkable into a routine. The claim is stark because the evidence that survives is not a lurid confession, but a set of administrative gestures. Inked lines, shorthand notations, marginal ticks, and the slow, deliberate rearrangement of names on a page. The story I want to tell begins with a book lying on a sun-warmed table, the leather softened at the spine, the edges of the paper browned to the color of tea, and with a small cuff of cotton, its hem secretly stitched and pressed flat as if hiding a name. Those two objects, the book and the cuff, are the points where private violence and public procedure meet. The ledger is not a neutral record. It is an instrument that made private coercion legible, enforceable, and replicable across years and generations. Open one of these ledgers, and the first thing you notice is not narrative but structure. Columns for names, columns for goods, shorthand for tasks and penalties. The scribe's hand moves with economy. Ink blots cluster where the day's work ended. Marginalia note whether a person has been moved from house to outbuilding, whether a child is to be listed as house charge, whether rations are to be cut. In the margins, terse phrases appear, sometimes a single word in a cramped hand that will be read by future stewards and overseers as authorization. Reassign, core, assign. Where a ledger records a change in sleeping quarters, it is not only a logistical note. It formally remaps privacy, exposure, and the possibilities for control. When an overseer writes "to other sleeping area," that ink does the work of law for the household. It designates who sleeps where, who is to be separated from whom, and what levels of guarding or surveillance will be considered normal. This is the mechanism historians pay attention to when we say a ledger did something. The process is replicable across multiple documents and multiple households. It tends to follow a pattern. A discovery or an allegation, sometimes an anonymous note folded and left in a kitchen corner, sometimes an overseer's report, triggers a household ritual. The steward is alerted, the minister is called in to pronounce a remedial formula or to perform a ceremony whose words serve as administrative seal. The scribe or bookkeeper records the outcome in the ledger, and the house follows that entry as instruction. Documents indicate that ritualized language and small tokens, an exchange of a coin, the minister's blessing recorded in the margin, were used as formalizers. Once the entry is made, the household treats it as adjudication rather than simply description. The ledger translates an event into an administrative fact. A single line in these books could rewrite a child's future. An entry that shifts a child from a parent's account to the household charge does not merely move a name on a page. It reallocates responsibility, rationing, and legal standing. A notation that cuts rations or that reassigns a woman to a less private sleeping space becomes precedent. Over time, the accumulation of entries produces genealogical effects. Children recorded as household are enumerated in later inventories. Names repeated across lists are reproduced in wills and sale rolls. What began as a shorthand decision is institutionalized into lineage. The ledger, in that sense, is an instrument of social engineering. It turns intimate violations into rules to be followed, and those rules endure. If this kind of archival reconstruction matters to you, and you want more of these evidentiary stories about how paperwork shaped lives, please subscribe and follow to learn how records make, and sometimes unmake, people legible to future authorities. To understand how this plays out in practice, we can look at a particular reconstruction we have been able to assemble from fragments. The life, so far as it can be traced, of a woman whose name appears in patchwork across a ledger, depositions, and a cloth cuff. For the purposes of this account, and to remain faithful to the archival form, I will refer to her by the name that appears stitched into the cuff, and repeated, in variants, across the records, Amina. The evidence is fragmentary. The reconstruction is provisional and hedged at every step. Records indicate her presence in household roles over a decade. Marginal notes in the ledger link her to a young man listed elsewhere as Daniel. A steward's penciled observation and later entries suggest a sequence of disciplinary measures and reassignments. None of these documents tell the private details of what transpired at night. What they do show, when read together, is how an accusation, whatever its private content, was absorbed into the household's bureaucratic machinery. The ledger entries that concern Amina are not dramatic in the sense of narrative flourish. They appear as brief annotations, a date, a shorthand reference to core, a sign, a small dagger mark that signals the scribe's eye should turn to the margin, and, on another page, a revised spend line showing reduced flour or sugar allotted to a particular household account. Alongside these notations sit lists of sleeping quarters and allocations of linen. One page, later backed and conserved, bears a faint impression beyond the ink, a pressure transfer where letters were scraped away. That scraping itself is a kind of silence that speaks, someone abridged or removed text. When investigator Lewis first photographed those pages, the abrasion looked indistinct. Under multiband lighting, the scraped strokes resolved into the ghost of an earlier explanatory phrase. The presence of scraping suggests that an earlier entry, perhaps a more candid account, was deliberately obscured. Depositins and later statements supply a different layer of evidence. They are not always direct reports of event, but they often record the administrative consequences that followed. A deposition might note that a child named in the ledger no longer appears under Amina's account after a certain date. An overseer's memorandum may itemize the reasons for cutting an individual's rations, citing house security or disciplinary realignment. These documentary fragments, when compared to the physical disposition of objects like the cuff, allow a triangulation. Ledger entry plus deposition plus material trace yields a plausible narrative of administrative separation and imposed exposure. That is how a historian moves from entries to meaning without inventing the private particulars that the records do not contain. The corrective assignment referenced in the books appears over and over in similar handwriting. Documents indicate it was a rubric used to formalize a transfer of status, one that often entailed relocation to less private quarters and more direct surveillance. In some instances, the correction came with a token, a minister's blessing logged in a margin, a coin handed over, and then recorded as paid for chastening, the combination of religious language and pecuniary notation together functioning as sanction and settlement. There is a terrible ordinariness to these entries. That ordinariness is their power. It is not always the size of the act, but its routinization that allows abuse to persist. Administrative language can sanitize and render procedural what is, in lived experience, intimate violation. At the same time as the ledger authorized these moves, material traces resisted that authorization. Conservator Amelia's report offers one of the most compelling counter-narratives. When Amelia unstitched and unfolded the cuff that had been tucked between two leaves of the ledger, she found layers of trace evidence. The cuff's fabric bore a pattern of careful hand-stitching at the hem, and on the inner fold, an indigo thread had been used to outline a name. "When I first held the cuff," Amelia later wrote, "I was struck by how deliberately it had been folded and placed, the hem tucked inward so the name would not be obvious to a casual reader. It seemed designed for concealment. The cuff's stitches are themselves a record of authorship. They demonstrate an intentional act to keep a personal artifact safe inside the very document that would otherwise be used to displace its owner." Between the cuff and the ledger were further objects: the faint impression of folded paper, the remnant of a string, a fragment of inked thread that may have once bound a letter. Conservators report the discovery of small folded notes sewn into hems of clothing sent to the institution's conservation lab. The notes are often tiny, barely more than slips, and many are too fragile to be fully unfolded. Even when their text cannot be recovered, their existence is evidence. People bent the risks of surveillance to create a clandestine system of communication. A hidden letter, a stitched name, a taut knot. These are acts of agency recorded in material form. They reveal that behavior under coercion was not only about suffering, but also about strategic preservation of ties and memory. We must be careful not to overstate what these items prove. The cuff's embroidered thread does not give us a scene, and the folded note does not narrate its writer's inner life. But the material survives where flesh does not, and the material tells us that Amina, if that is indeed the name on the cuff, sought to assert continuity of identity. In a household that reclassified persons and redistributed children on a ledger line, the cuff becomes a small instrument of persistence. It resists the ledger's claim to totalizing knowledge by keeping a name private, by preserving an ownership of self beneath a public record. Resistance appears in other archival forms as well. Neighbor depositions and the testimony of other household occupants, always subject to the limits and partiality of their perspectives, sometimes record clandestine teaching or the passing of knowledge by candlelight. A scribe's marginal note might record that an individual taught reading on a Sunday evening, or that secret lessons took place in an attic. These entries are typically phrased as accusations or excuses in official records, but read sideways they become evidence of instruction and cultural transmission. The ledger and its judicial language do not fully capture the ways people exceeded or subverted their assigned roles. They can only record acts when those acts are either sanctioned or discovered. The hidden moments, the needlework, the whispered lessons, leave traces in material culture more often than they appear in inked adjudication. The process of making sense of these traces forces historians and conservators to confront erasure as a method. Pages are trimmed, margins are scraped, leaves are missing. These absences are not merely the result of time. In many instances, the physical mutilation of documents, cut edges where names once stood, rubbed surfaces where lines were removed, is itself evidence of intentional suppression. A trimmed leaf can indicate a deliberate attempt to erase a relationship or hide an impropriety from future scrutiny. The absence of a page is as data-rich as its presence. When we find stubs of paper with uneven edges, or when we detect underdrawing beneath scraped ink using multispectral imaging, we are encountering the afterlife of decisions made in the moment of scandal. That is why triangulation matters in reconstructive work. A single ledger line, standing alone, is prone to misinterpretation. Combined with depositions, with probate inventories, with objects conserved in a lab, it becomes part of a multidimensional record. Professor Andrews and investigator Lewis have each emphasized that method. Andrews has shown, through comparative analysis of similar ledgers in other households, that core, assign. Entries often preceded reductions in rations and the reassignment of children. Lewis has traced an administrative sequence in which a steward's note is echoed in a minister's marginal blessing and then formalized by a scribe. Together, these patterns allow us to interpret individual cases like Amina's as instances of a broader institutional practice rather than as isolated, inexplicable events. Throughout this work, we must remain cautious about certainty. Where pages are missing or lines are scraped, our reconstructions are necessarily provisional. Words like suggest, indicate, and consistent with are not rhetorical hedges designed to obscure. They are crucial epistemic markers. They tell an audience that the narrative we are assembling is conditional, based on evidence that is partial, contested, and subject to new interpretation should new materials surface. This kind of humility and historical inference both preserves honesty and keeps space open for descendants and communities to bring additional knowledge to light. The long-term consequences of administrative decisions recorded in ledgers extend beyond the immediate household. Repeated entries that reassign children or that list kin under different statuses ripple into later documents, census data, plantation inventories, probate lists. What begins as an administrative act in one ledger can affect how families appear in legal documents decades later. Inheritance rights are affected. Genealogical claims are obscured. Familial bonds become attenuated on paper even as they survive in oral memory. For those trying to reconstruct family lines today, the very records that historians consult can be part of the problem, shaping an archival record that privileges certain categories and erases others. That insight yields an ethical imperative. If ledgers were instruments that helped to normalize coercion and remap kinship, then the preservation of the counter-evidence, the cuffs, the letters, the marginalia, is a matter of justice. Conservators and small local archives are frequently the custodians of these fragile materials, yet their work is often underfunded. Proper conservation, careful cataloging, and accessible digitization are necessary if these objects are to survive as evidence. They require resources and institutional commitment. We have to regard funding archives not as an optional expense, but as a civic responsibility if the public history we curate is to include the voices and traces that bureaucracies tried to obscure. Preservation also demands ethical stewardship. Handling these items requires sensitivity to the people they represent and to the descendants they may touch. It is not enough to make an object legible to scholars alone. Archives must consider how best to engage communities, to foster dialogue, and to provide context that does not reduce individuals to case studies. The ledger entry that reassigns a child is not an abstract line. It is a decision that touched lives. Exhibitions and catalog entries should therefore foreground the human consequences of administrative practices and resist the temptation to treat these records as purely technical artifacts. There is also a methodological lesson for historians and for the public. We should not assume that absence equals nothingness. The wounds made to a document, trimmed edges, scraped ink, are themselves evidence of suppression. The presence of a folded cuff inside a ledger is an index of how people tried to protect memory against bureaucratic dehumanization. Reading archives, in other words, requires attention to both what is written and what has been forcibly removed. It requires an imagination disciplined by method to reconstruct what is plausible on the basis of multiple converging traces without converting conjecture into fact. What does this mean for the ordinary reader or viewer encountering these objects for the first time? It means that an ostensibly mundane bookkeeping volume can be a site of violence and resistance alike. It means that the language of the ledger, its terms, its shorthand, its margins, is not merely administrative vocabulary, but a set of practices that produce social reality. It means that ordinary household rituals, recorded in ink, can result in long-term dispossession, altered family structures, and inherited disadvantage. And it means that acts of concealment, stitching a name into a cuff, folding a note into a seam, are not only gestures of survival, but also testimonies that the human will to persist cannot be fully disciplined by paperwork. We end then with responsibility. If the ledger made the unthinkable routine, then the ledger and the objects that intersect with it must be cared for as sites of memory. That care is practical and political. Fund conservation projects that stabilize fragile textiles and parchment. Support local repositories that house these fragile collections. Advocate for digitization that makes the documents accessible to descendants and researchers alike. And support ethical public history initiatives that center affected communities in decisions about interpretation and display. These are not grandiose prescriptions. They are modest, concrete steps that protect the fragile evidence of lived experience. The work of conservators like Amelia, investigators like Lewis, and scholars like Professor Andrews illuminates how administrative systems produce harm, and how communities find ways to resist. Their work also shows how attentive preservation can turn small, hidden objects, a worn cuff, the ghost of scraped ink, into instruments for truth-telling. If you are moved by what you have heard and want to act, consider supporting local archives or conservation efforts that work on these materials. Look for community-based historical projects to donate to or volunteer with. And, if you can, leave a reflection below about what these documents ask of us today. How a book of names became, in practice, an instrument of control, and how stitched hems and hidden notes kept human stories alive. Remember that the ledger did its work by making certain choices legible. Our work now is to keep other choices, acts of care, memory, and resistance, equally visible.